Sorry, that took a little time to get going. But I wanted to, one of the things I changed from last semester, I wanted to do this last semester, but I didn't have any kind of wireless mic, and I didn't want to put a mic in the back of the room and have it catching the whole sound. So it's only going to catch what I'm saying up here. So unless you're asking some kind of question close to me, you don't got to worry about being captured on it. I think we are rolling back there, so I can edit it out at any point. So I'll get to a good starting spot and get going. I think I need a little sip of coffee first. But so as will be normally the case when we're starting a new, any kind of new system, we'll do kind of an overview of the system, and then we're going to jump into the class notes. I didn't really say anything about the class activity or what I call the class notes, but those are the questions that you have here. This is what the quiz is based off of. In fact, before I get into slides, let's look at that real quick. I'm going to switch then to our endocrine system PowerPoint. I've got two of them pulled up. One of them is our endocrine system PowerPoint, which is new tonight. I'm going to try and get as far through that as I can. And then there's the continuation of the organ system survey that we just really kind of got maybe a third of the way through last time. Looking ahead to Tuesday, I don't know that I'm going to get all the way through the endocrine system tonight. There's just so much with the endocrine system. It just seems like it's scattered. We have to know the names of a bunch of different glands. We have to know the names of the hormones that come out of those glands. And we have to know where those hormones go and what they do. So it's a lot of disconnected, seemingly disconnected information. So I think maybe a double dose of that might be helpful. And I have thrown in a new case study that we can do as a group that, again, just kind of gets us thinking about the endocrine glands. We obviously won't be able to get to all of that stuff today, so that's the plan for Tuesday. And if for some reason we can get ahead on this, maybe I'll introduce a little bit of blood information early. But that's the to-do list. Any questions about that at all? All right. Well, I'm going to jump into the endocrine system stuff. And if you have those class handouts, there are some matching questions there that I should be able to answer just by kind of writing some stuff on the board. So here is kind of a description of the endocrine system. I mentioned a collection of ductless glands, and we'll get to them in the slides real quick. I just wanted to put something up. Sometimes, let's just define endocrine system first. As a collection of ductless glands. We're going to say a collection of ductless glands that secrete hormones into the bloodstream. All right, and I'll try and sketch that a little. This can just represent our random endocrine gland here. And it's a ductless gland that's just going to start to spit out these hormones that it produces. And I'll just let these be represented by different letters. I don't know. Right, so it's producing 3 different types of hormones. And hormones, we will see, are just chemical signals that are produced by a cell. What makes them a hormone is that they're not a local signal. They don't affect cells that are just nearby. Instead, these are going to be chemical signals that are going to jump into a bloodstream and travel to some far off, distant patch of tissues. So we'll just let this obviously represent our bloodstream. And then down here, in a different area, we're going to put a collection of target cells. In fact, maybe we can make a comparison between target cells and what we will call non-target cells. Target cells are, well, let's draw those first. These are going to be any cell. I'll draw these funny cells like this, where we're going to see one side of, this is the nucleus, that little dot that I'm putting in there. We're going to see that a couple of these target cells have specialized docking sites for certain chemical signals. The letters that I've used to represent there, since I'm not the best artist, I'm just going to label that this is a docking site for one of those X hormones, and this can be a docking site for one of the Y hormones. Maybe there's another cell here that has a docking site for an A hormone. Right? Maybe there's another one over here that has a docking site for a C hormone. Right? So there's all these different cells that have receptor sites. But cells are only going to be targeted if they're only going to be able to sense the presence of a hormone if they have a receptor for it. So in the example that I was just about to use, we've got an endocrine gland up here that's pumping hormones into the bloodstream. We've got X, we've got Y, we've got Z. So at some point, these chemical signals are going to travel through the bloodstream and out into these distant tissues. So we've got our Z, we've got Y, we've got X. When these hormones are looking for places to dock to, the only two that are going to get to activate a cell are obviously the cells that have receptors for particular hormones. So we would refer to these as target cells. And all the other cells that don't have any proper receptors, they're never going to know those chemical signals are there. It takes a while for these chemical signals to move through bloodstreams and to bathe over tissues. So that's the negative, that they take hours or minutes, right, to reach these things. But they're very target specific when they get there. They can hit specific cells and not affect adjacent cells at all. So target cells just means they have a receptor, they can respond to a hormone. Non-target cell means it doesn't have the proper receptor. It's never going to be able to detect that hormone. Hello. Thanks for risking the roads and coming to class. You're just in time. I think that might help answer the first two questions on there. And what I was just doing there is I was comparing, to kind of transition to our slides here, I was comparing the nervous system to the endocrine system. When we were introducing systems last semester, I got all excited when we got to the nervous system or the endocrine system. I said, put stars next to these two systems because they are considered the master control systems, and they help control the other organ systems that we mentioned. They just control the other organ systems in completely different ways, right? We said the nervous system was a control mechanism that used these rapid moving electrical impulses. So we're talking milliseconds, very short duration. We were drawing those action potentials. I think I used the example of wiggling your big toe. You know, that's a rapid way of communication from one part of the body to the next. But if you are going to, release hormones into the bloodstream, like this obviously, depending on what hormones we're talking about, can take minutes or hours. Like if I go ingest a big bag of Snickers bars or something after that, it's going to take several minutes for my body to sense that, to start to pump out the insulin and get my blood glucose levels back down. So that can sometimes take a couple of hours. So much slower moving chemical signals, they can have longer lasting effects. They're after the same target organs again, they just control them in different ways. Rapid moving electrical signals or slow moving chemical signals. And I have to catch myself when I say slow-moving chemical signals because it makes it seem like they're at a disadvantage, but really the big advantage is that they are much more target-specific than those electrical signals. I guess that was what I was trying to do with that little sketch over there. Now to what we will probably spend most of the time on, and that's introducing the various different endocrine glands. We'll need to know the hormones that come out of those endocrine glands, what their target cells are, and sometimes what the response of that target cell is going to be. I think also what's interesting is that these glands are not very big. We can kind of see a snapshot of the collection of a few of these endocrine glands in this human model here. But I thought it was kind of interesting that if I wanted to get a bowl and put 2 pounds of endocrine tissue into it, we would need 9 adults to donate all of their endocrine glands just to get 2 pounds of this stuff. So it's not a lot, right? These are small ductless glands scattered throughout the body. Here is kind of what I put on the board. What makes it a chemical signal? Let me say that again. What makes one of these particular chemical signals a hormone, like I mentioned, is the fact that it jumps into the bloodstream and travels to some other tissues in the body. There are what we would refer to as local chemical signals. So there's a couple of other terms on here like autocrine and paracrine. Autocrine just means that, this is a chemical signal that a cell makes that works on the cell that made it, right? So autocrine would be chemical signals that help a cell self-regulate. Paracrine, this is also kind of similar. This would be a cell, an endocrine gland to be specific, that is releasing chemical signals, but these chemical signals just float through extracellular fluid and dock to a cell right next to it. They never have to jump into the bloodstream and move to other tissues. So these local signals, local chemical signals, are what we call paracrines. And then hormones are, again, structurally the same as autocrines or paracrines. What makes them a hormone is that they, again, jump into a bloodstream and move to a distant part of the body before they dock to another cell. So think long distance signaling with hormones versus local signaling with paracrine. Or never leaving the cell with autocrine signals. We're going to classify hormones, like obviously when we hear the word hormone, we're thinking chemical signal that jumps into the bloodstream and moves through the bloodstream and is going to jump out of the bloodstream at a certain point and try and hit certain target cells. When we're talking about these hormones, we're going to first break them into two broad categories, whether they are lipid soluble or whether they are water soluble. We'll see the lipid soluble ones are obviously made out of cholesterol derivatives. Maybe that's not obvious on this slide, but if you think back to your 1406 class, this plasma membrane, it's made out of phospholipids. It is a non-polar wall. It's made out of non-polar molecules. So any other molecule that's non-polar, lipid molecules are non-polar, they're going to be able to move across this plasma membrane with ease. So as we classify these two different hormones, that's obviously we need to know the different names, but we need to know how that affects these hormones. So lipid-soluble hormones can move across plasma membranes with ease. They need no special channel. It would be like if I just moved through the wall out into the hallway. I can't do that. I need some type of door to let me out into the hallway. So I can't just cross a membrane anywhere I want. I would be behaving more like one of these water-soluble hormones. These are made out of protein derivatives. They're not lipid-soluble. They can't cross a membrane anywhere. They have to dock to certain receptors, which is kind of what I was drawing there on the board. So to say that again, there are two types of hormones. We refer to them as either water-soluble hormones. Instead of calling them water-soluble, sometimes I will refer to them as protein-based or amino acid-based, versus the ones that are lipid-soluble. I will sometimes just refer to them as cholesterol-based or steroid-based. The real thing that comes back that we need to remember is how they get into cells or how they dock to certain receptors. Like I just said, water-soluble ones are not going to be, once they travel through the bloodstream and jump out of the bloodstream and try and hit their target cell, they're not going to move into the cell. They're going to dock to receptors on the surface of that cell. And what they do, once they dock to receptors on the surface of the cell, they basically activate proteins that were already present inside the cell, that were just inactive. I'll put an example of this up on the board in just a second, but I want to make a distinction not only between how water-soluble hormones dock to cells versus the lipid-soluble ones. We also want to talk about the response that they cause, basically. So water-soluble hormones, they never move into the cell. They just land on the outside of the cell, and they activate all of what are these inactive proteins inside the cell that are sometimes collectively just referred to as second messengers. So this would be the first messenger that docks to the outside of the cell, and then you've got all of these second messengers that carry out the response. They were there the whole time. They were just turned off. And what turns them on is a chemical signal that docks to the outside of the cell. That's a lot of times how these water-soluble hormones work. Any medication that you take, that the doctor gives you some medication, says take this with a glass of water. If you wash this down, these are things that are going to be water-soluble. They're going to be docking to cells on the cell surface, and they're going to activate secondary messengers inside of cells. That's a little different than lipid-soluble hormones. Just by looking at this picture without any of these other words on the screen, we can just look to see what's going on. And at the top, I can't reach all the way up there, but we can see there, what? I think I might be able to use this thing. We can see in this case there is a chemical signal right here, and it just crosses that plasma membrane no problem at all. So that's the first clue that we're dealing with a lipid-soluble hormone. The second clue is you can see once it gets inside the cell, it leads to the synthesis of a brand new protein. So we're not activating a protein that's already there. This isn't involving secondary messengers. This is involving building a new protein that was not present to begin with. So again, just to recap, water-soluble hormones dock to the outside of cells and they activate secondary messengers inside of cells. Doesn't create any kind of new protein. It just activates proteins that were already there. Lipid-soluble hormones move into cells. They directly cause protein synthesis of some new type of protein. Lipid-soluble, hormones or medications, these are things that you don't have to drink with a glass of water. These can be things you can rub into the skin or creams. They can move through plasma membranes with ease, right? Anyway, I'll leave that there. Here is something that I kept plugging last time, and now we can see a little bit more details about, and it is going to be one of the main things to remember for this lecture. We need to know the 3 different mechanisms or the 3 triggers that really stimulate endocrine glands and cause them to start releasing their hormones. Right? I think I was trying to ask this question last time. We not only need to know a list of endocrine glands and their hormones and their target cells, but we need to know, what would be the reasons why these endocrine glands would want to release certain hormones in the first place. There's only 3 mechanisms that we're going to mention here. Hopefully these are large enough that we can see them on the screen. The first one that we're going to mention is a humoral control. Remember, humoral and hormonal sound very similar. Hormones we know are chemical signals that move through the bloodstream. Humoral is referring to fluid of the body. In this case, this fluid inside the bloodstreams has to be constantly monitored in terms of its concentration of things like glucose or calcium in this case. And there are receptors that have their little ends in blood vessels that are constantly monitoring the fluid level of things like calcium and glucose. And if the fluid level of calcium gets too low, that's a fluid stimulus. This endocrine gland picks it up. In particular, we're looking at these parathyroid glands. They detect that blood calcium levels are too low. The heart neurons, they all need calcium levels. So in order to boost calcium levels, parathyroid hormone is released. This is kind of an easy one to remember. Parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone. And what parathyroid hormone is going to do is it's going to increase blood calcium levels. Right? It's going to go into those cells we talked about, those osteoclasts, and it's going to start to dissolve bone tissue. And as bone tissue is dissolved, that calcium is released into the bloodstream, and it gets us back up to operating levels of calcium in the bloodstream. Obviously, if it goes too far and we've got too much calcium in the bloodstream, again, that's another fluid type of stimulus that's going to instead stimulate some cells in the thyroid to produce what we'll call calcitonin. It'll do the opposite of parathyroid hormone, stimulate osteoblast and reduce blood calcium levels. I think I mentioned, maybe I didn't, maybe we haven't mentioned that yet, but sometimes hormones have this opposing effect with one another, which would be the case with parathyroid hormone and calcitonin when we talk about it. One increases blood calcium levels, the other one decreases blood calcium levels. But again, not that I need to go too far with that. We're just pointing out that sometimes endocrine glands are stimulated to release their hormones based off of a fluid stimulus, a humoral stimulus. There are other cases where there is a direct neural connection to endocrine glands. This was the case with the adrenal medulla. There is a direct neural connection to those modified cells in the adrenal medulla. Those modified cells in the adrenal medulla can pump out hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, whenever they're told to do so. And they do so very quickly because we know neural signals are very rapidly sent. So it doesn't take very long for I think I might have mentioned, hearing some loud, scary noise or something like that, and stress hormones ending up in your bloodstream. That's a very quick neural stimulus to get that gland to release its hormones. So neural stimulus is another one. We'll see a couple of other examples of neural stimulus. The posterior pituitary gland is one, and the pineal gland is another one. Then finally, we've got hormonal stimulus, and we'll see a lot of this as well. This is a case where, there's a lot going on with this slide. The first thing that you'll want to see is there is a hypothalamus up here that is in its own right an endocrine gland, because it is releasing chemical signals into a bloodstream, into a little blood vessel here. Those chemical signals travel through the blood vessel into this anterior pituitary gland, and you can see this anterior pituitary gland is releasing hormones in response. So this would be a good example. Hypothalamus to anterior pituitary gland is a good example of hormonal control. This anterior pituitary gland either will or won't release hormones depending on the presence of hormonal signals coming from the hypothalamus. That's half of the story here. You can see there are other endocrine glands in this picture, and that is something that I might as well point out. I used the term last time, tropic hormone versus non-tropic hormone. We will see that any of these hormones produced from the hypothalamus, you can consider those tropic hormones, because what we said a tropic hormone does is, a tropic hormone, like any hormone does, hormones are looking for target cells, right? If it is a tropic hormone, that's basically saying that its target cell is another endocrine gland. And its response when it lands on that endocrine gland is to get that endocrine gland to release a secondary hormone. So all of these would be hormonally controlled as well. The thyroid gland releases thyroid hormones if it's told to do so by the anterior pituitary gland. So we've got hormonal control. This is thyroid stimulating hormone that would come from the anterior pituitary gland. We would consider this thyroid stimulating hormone also a tropic hormone, because it's going to an endocrine gland, and that endocrine gland releases more hormones. Anyway, tropic hormones and non-tropic hormones. These parathyroid hormone over here, this is a non-tropic hormone. It's not going to an endocrine gland. It's not causing any other hormones to be released. It's going, like we said, to those osteoclasts and getting those osteoclasts to dissolve bone tissue and increase calcium levels in the blood. Right? Epinephrine, norepinephrine, these are going to blood vessels, causing some to dilate, some to constrict. It's not causing further endocrine glands to release hormones. Any kind of hormone that is going to another endocrine gland and getting further hormone releases, like we said, tropic hormones. All right, I'll come away from that. We've now seen those three different mechanisms that can stimulate the release of certain hormones. This slide just points out a couple of different relationships between different types of hormones. I was just about to say this a second ago, but I realized we hadn't got to the slide yet. These are three types of interactions between hormones. The first one that we'll mention up here is what's called permissiveness. And in this permissiveness type of relationship, you've got one hormone that can't really exhibit its full force without another hormone being present. And one good example of this would be things like testosterone and estrogen. These are responsible for the development of secondary sex characteristics in males and females. However, testosterone and estrogen won't be able to do its work if there isn't sufficient amounts of T3 and T4 present. We'll see that T3 and T4, these are hormones that come from the thyroid gland, and they really stimulate cells to ramp up their metabolic activity, right? So cells that are just sluggish and are just not wanting to do anything, it doesn't matter if there's testosterone and estrogen there, the cells aren't really going to do much with it. Right? But if there's a lot of T3 and T4 there, cells are fired up, doing a bunch of metabolic reactions, this is going to increase the effectiveness of testosterone and estrogen. It works with other hormones too. That's just one example of permissiveness. Another example here, jump to the next one, is synergism. This is where you have hormones that can amplify one another's effects. So I think we did just look at the slide where we were talking about epinephrine and norepinephrine. coming from the adrenal medulla gland. That is a hormone that can greatly boost the effects of glucagon. Glucagon, we will come to know as one of these hormones that comes from the pancreas. It's going to cause cells to start to produce glucose from things like proteins and lipids. Its goal is to increase glucose levels in the bloodstream, and it can really amplify the effects of how much glucose it can put in the bloodstream if epinephrine is added in there with it. Again, somewhere around 150 times the amount of glucose could be produced if glucagon is incorporated with epinephrine. So this amplification effect is what we refer to as synergism. And the last one here is antagonism, which is what I was referring to earlier, where you've got hormones that oppose one another's effects. So insulin decreases blood glucose levels, where glucagon is going to try and increase blood glucose levels. Together they keep us within that tolerable range. I just mentioned we could switch those terms with calcitonin and parathyroid hormone if we wanted to talk about calcium levels as opposed to glucose levels. So anyway, 3 different types of interactions between hormones. Not that that's a huge part of the class. What is more likely to show back up is the location, the names of endocrine glands, and the hormones that they produce. So here we are back to this slide, where I feel like the next few slides we get into are going to start at the top with I think even if you have that lab list from last time, I've got a couple of extra ones if you happen to not get that lab list. Does anybody need that lab list from last time? I've got 5 additional ones here. You know, the first part there of this organ system survey, it takes us through maybe 7 or 8 of those endocrine glands, and I will go through that list in probably the same order, somewhere close to that order. And I'm going to try and answer some of the questions in the lecture handout as we go through that. We start at the top of the list here with this hypothalamus pituitary gland relationship. And remember, the hypothalamus is this little funnel-shaped area just beneath this. There's our oval-shaped thalamus, and then down here is our hypothalamus. We're going to see some details about it. In fact, there's collections of different types of neurons in that hypothalamus. I feel like I may want to draw this, but we'll see if I can refrain for just a little bit from drawing this thing. As we zoom into this hypothalamus, one of the things that I want to try and draw here, if I get around to it, is that there is, between the hypothalamus and this pituitary gland down here, there is a little bit of a different connection between the way the hypothalamus connects to the posterior pituitary gland. You can see there's almost a direct connection between the same tan-colored tissue that makes up this posterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Can you see that? That's because this posterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus are made out of mostly neural tissue. This anterior pituitary gland, it's a little bit darker staining. When we look at the cells here of the anterior pituitary gland, they're a little bit more plump. They're individually each larger cells, and they are producing many more hormones than we see in the posterior pituitary gland. There's only 2 hormones that are going to be coming out of this posterior pituitary gland that we have to know. So it's a short list versus 7 hormones that we have to be aware of that come out of this anterior pituitary gland. So just a little bit of a difference there. There's some questions in the lecture handout about that. Here again, you know, as we're approaching that pituitary gland, this is another slide that's trying to show what I was just talking about, that there's more of a direct neural connection between the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary gland compared to the connection between the hypothalamus and this anterior pituitary gland. Even right here, you can see through the actual, this is a cross section through this little connecting bit of tissue between anterior and posterior pituitary gland. And you can even kind of from a distance see that this collection of cells in the anterior pituitary gland are a little bit larger cells than the ones back here in the posterior pituitary gland. You can still see a lot of these little stretchy fibers, which are mostly neural tissue, compared to these secretory cells of that anterior pituitary gland. And I'm sure that's probably going to be washed out on the camera, but you can again see lighter staining tissue versus darker staining tissue. This is one easy distinguishing slide between anterior pituitary gland and posterior pituitary gland. You can also see that number 3 up there, which is, I guess, we're looking at a mirror image of these numbers here. But that connection there is even more obvious here between posterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, that it's just a continuation of this neural tissue that comes down and connects those two structures, where that anterior pituitary gland is a little different. Here's what may be sufficient. This is what I wanted to draw on the board, and I will let this diagram be sufficient for that. There in the hypothalamus, we're going to see collections of a bunch of different types of nuclei. And in this slide, it's showing us the first 2 collections of nuclei that we have to be aware of. These, again, are the cell body and the dendrites. All of these stay in the hypothalamus, but their long axon portions reach all the way down. They go straight through that connection between the posterior pituitary gland and hypothalamus. And those axons, you can see they dead end into this capillary of the posterior pituitary gland. There are 2 hormones released by this posterior pituitary gland, and I'm careful with my words there to say that these hormones are released from the posterior pituitary gland, but they are not produced in the posterior pituitary gland. To be clear, those hormones are produced in the cell bodies of these nuclei. So they are produced in the hypothalamus, they are sent down these long axon portions, and then they are released into this capillary bed of the posterior pituitary gland. Maybe that's being a little bit nitpicky. I probably won't count off if you just, be careful not to say that the posterior pituitary gland produces any hormones. It doesn't produce anything. That is the release point for hormones that are produced by these collection of nuclei. There is a collection, these blue colored nuclei, they are naming paraventricular nuclei. If you're making notes, the paraventricular nuclei are the ones that release oxytocin. The green staining collection of nuclei, these are named the supraoptic nuclei, and what they produce is antidiuretic hormone. I'll share with you my weird memory tip of how I always remember that. It's the opposite of how you think it would be. That's how I remember it, right? Let me show you what I mean by that. Oxytocin, like my brain sees that O in oxytocin, and then I see that O in supraoptic nuclei, and I'm thinking, I want to match those O's up. And you even see an A in paraventricular, and there's an A in antidiuretic hormone, and it would be sweet if they just lined up, but they don't. It's the opposite of that. So as long as you can remember that, then when you're filling out the questions on the lecture handout, paraventricular nuclei, oxytocin. Supraoptic nuclei, antidiuretic hormone. We'll talk about where they go and what they do in just a second. But I think it's easier to start off with this posterior pituitary gland because there's only 2 hormones that are coming out of it. And also, you can see what a capillary bed is supposed to look like. This is what most capillary beds, in fact, all but 2 capillary beds in the body do. Here's our little capillary bed. Capillary beds are fed by an artery. Like this feeds blood into a capillary bed, and then you've got a vein that drains blood away from a capillary bed, and in the middle of there you've got the capillaries. Simple capillary bed, that's how they typically work, but that's not the case for the anterior pituitary gland. It gets a little bit more confusing. If you have the class notes out before I get too far, this is question number 8. This is on the back side of the first page. It says hypothalamus posterior pituitary flow chart. What does number 2 represent in your little flow chart? And the answer to number 2 is this hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. You may remember from our class last time, we said the word nuclei, when we're thinking about the brain and spinal cord, the word nuclei refers to a collection of cell bodies in the brain or spinal cord. And we said a collection of axon portions of those neurons in the brain or spinal cord we call a tract. Remember, outside of the brain and spinal cord, we would call those things neurons and ganglia. But we're inside the brain and spinal cord, so we call this a tract. the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Directly, it's a neural connection between that hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. You can see just above that we're about to go to the anterior pituitary gland. There's just more going on the anterior pituitary gland, so I thought it would be better to start with this posterior pituitary gland. How are we doing though? Are we ready to move maybe to anterior pituitary stuff? Okay, before we do, there's actually just 2 slides that mention oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone a little better. I'll say a couple of things about them here. Oxytocin is something that one of the target organs that it goes after is the uterine wall, and it stimulates the uterine wall to contract during delivery. That's one thing. It also stimulates mammary glands to produce milk. It's also known as the love hormone. So if you are in love with somebody, right, this is the hormone that you're feeling a lot of the times when you're cuddling on the couch or whatever. The next one that's coming out of that posterior pituitary gland is the antidiuretic hormone. These are going to affect certain cells of the kidney that we are going to draw and label with detail later on in the semester. But right now we just have to know antidiuretic hormone is going to affect the kidney. And the wording there is a little weird. Just think that it's going to cause that kidney to hold on to more water, to retain that water. It doesn't want any water being wasted in the urine. So if you are taking a bunch of antidiuretic hormone, it's going to make you have very small amounts of very concentrated urine, right? That water isn't going to leave your body. It's going to be held, right? The kidney tubules are going to reclaim that water and keep it in the bloodstream. Maybe an opposite of that, like sometimes if you if you have a kidney stone or something, you need to go to the bathroom a lot, they will put you on something like, I don't know, grape juice or cranberry juice or whatever it is, something that they call a diuretic, right? A diuretic is going to make you go to the bathroom a lot, and you'll have large amounts of very diluted urine. And an antidiuretic hormone is the opposite of that, right? So very small amounts of concentrated urine. It's sometimes also referred to as vasopressin. So some textbooks will say vasopressin. That is identical to antidiuretic hormone, so whatever word you want to use. Now we're at the anterior pituitary gland, and I'm going to say posterior pituitary gland and anterior pituitary gland are 50% of this lecture. So if I can not lose you after anterior pituitary gland, we're over halfway done. But there's a lot going on with this anterior pituitary gland. And let me point out one of the first differences between this anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland, and that's how it's controlled. This is a weird looking capillary bed. And I say weird because there is one artery that feeds the capillary bed. This is what's known as the capillary bed of the hypothalamus. We can see it's just barely touching the hypothalamus. So there's that capillary bed of the hypothalamus. And then there are veins that drain this capillary bed, but these veins, they go directly into another capillary bed, right? And then at the end of this second capillary bed, there's a vein that drains the blood away from that capillary bed. So this is one of the 2 places in the body where we have these weird blood vessels that drain one capillary bed and lead directly to a second capillary bed. So blood vessels that run between 2 capillary beds we're going to call portal veins. There's going to be a hypothalamic portal vein that we're looking at here, and then the other one we're going to see is in the liver. We'll call that the hepatic portal vein. But hypophyseal portal vein is the one that we're looking at here that connects the capillary bed of the hypothalamus to the capillary bed of the anterior pituitary gland. So our first portal vein we've seen, and also if you're keeping track of the class notes, this would be number 7 on page 2. That asks, in the flow chart that you're presented with there, what does number 3 represent? And that would be the connecting point between the capillaries of the hypothalamus and the capillary beds here of the anterior pituitary gland. Answer, hypophyseal portal veins. Okay, the other thing to mention is, well, there's a couple of things to mention. I'll just start right up here with this collection of neurons that we see in the hypothalamus. These are much shorter neurons. You can see how they dead end right there at that capillary bed in the hypothalamus. They never make their way into the pituitary gland. They stay entirely in the hypothalamus. This is where I wish I had a drawing on the board that I'm not able to write something on the screen. But we can say that this collection of nuclei, they are going to be releasing what are called, maybe I'll just put this over here. They're sometimes written as a certain abbreviation followed by either RH or IH. So I'll just put a little ... RH or ... IH. The RH stands for releasing hormone, where the IH is going to stand for inhibiting hormone. That means that there are one of two classes of hormones that are going to be coming down from the hypothalamus. Again, hormones are pumped into one blood vessel, they move through the body, and they affect other target cells. So the hypothalamus can send a releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary gland. That's going to cause this anterior pituitary gland to release hormones, obviously. Or the hypothalamus could send an inhibitory signal, inhibitory chemical signal, that is, to the anterior pituitary gland to prevent this anterior pituitary gland from releasing any hormones. So what I'm trying to say here is that the hypothalamus also controls the anterior pituitary gland, but it does so by way of chemical signals. Right? One chemical signal is a release signal, and the other one is an inhibitory signal. Just like the hypothalamus controls the posterior pituitary gland, but again, the posterior pituitary gland is a direct neural control where there is no direct neural control to the anterior pituitary gland. This is instead controlled hormonally. So kind of what I was just thinking about, the triggers that cause endocrine glands to release hormones, it's either a neural signal in some cases it's a hormonal signal. And then, like we saw with the other example with blood calcium levels, it can be a fluid signal.
What did you say that the RH was again?
Releasing hormone. And let's look at some examples of that. In fact, that's the very next thing that we have here. There's going to be about 4 different hormones that are going to come from the anterior pituitary gland. One example of those hormones could be growth hormone. So this growth hormone releasing hormone, or there is growth hormone inhibiting hormone, kind of the two different endings that you could have. The prefix on that tells you which hormone it is going to be stimulating. So this hypothalamus could stimulate the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland, or it could inhibit the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. Obviously, this box represents hormones coming from the hypothalamus. And then over here, we have a list of hormones that could come out of the anterior pituitary gland. I highlighted in blue those hormones that we would consider tropic hormones. Again, these then are going to be targeting other endocrine glands, where the non-highlighted ones are going to be targeting something other than an endocrine gland, like the growth hormone at the top. That's going to be targeting muscles and bones and stimulating more muscle and bone development. Prolactin is stimulating mammary glands to get milk production. Melanocyte stimulating hormone is stimulating those melanocytes to produce their melanin. None of those are causing, those aren't endocrine glands, but all of the ones in blue, these are going to go after an endocrine gland, and they're going to get that endocrine gland to release another hormone. So thyroid stimulating hormone is going after the thyroid. It's going to cause that thyroid to release what we call T3 and T4 hormones. This adrenocorticotropic hormone, it seems like a mouthful, this is going after the cortex of the adrenal gland. We had just seen that the adrenal medulla has a neuron that goes directly to it. It's neurally controlled. But the outer edges, the cortex of that adrenal gland, is going to be controlled by hormones, specifically this hormone coming from the anterior pituitary gland. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are both going to be going after reproductive organs. So follicle stimulating hormone is going after ovaries or testes. Luteinizing hormone going after either going after ovaries to cause rupturing of the follicle and ovulation to occur, or in males stimulating testosterone production. Anyway, here's another slide that kind of shows that. What I like about this slide is that it gives you some more examples. Megan just had the question about, what is it exactly that comes from the hypothalamus? I just gave the RH or IH, and you can see TRH. I think that might be something on the back side of your class notes. I gave you a bunch of abbreviations of hormones, and then on the page just in front of that you've got the full name, so you really don't have to look those up other than just flip the pages back and forth. But just to give you an example, TRH, this is thyrotropic releasing hormone. There is another version of this, we could call it TIH, that would inhibit the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. If TRH, this is the releasing hormone, goes from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary gland, this is going to stimulate the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. Again, just to go back to this slide, maybe. Just to go back to this slide, thyroid stimulating hormone was one of those tropic hormones. So we know this is coming from the anterior pituitary gland. It's going to another endocrine gland, in this case the thyroid gland, and it's going to get that thyroid gland to release T3 and T4, which...
Are all of those hormones produced in the anterior pituitary, or are they being produced in the hypothalamus and then just being released?
Good question. These are produced there in the anterior pituitary gland. So the only thing that's being produced in the hypothalamus are these releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. Right. Good clarification. I guess I implied that without ever saying it, but yes.
What about the other ones? The other hormones like oxytocin and all those? Those are produced in the hypothalamus?
So let's jump back to that real, was that here? Jumping back to posterior pituitary gland, remember there's no hormones produced in the posterior pituitary gland. Those hormones are produced in the cell bodies of these nuclei that live up there in the hypothalamus. So those hormones are just released directly into the capillary bed of the posterior pituitary gland. Right? And that's a little different than jumping over to anterior pituitary gland. Here we've got, again, nuclei in the hypothalamus, but they're not releasing their chemical signals into the anterior pituitary gland. They're releasing chemical signals into this capillary bed of right there at the bottom of the hypothalamus, and it's instead this chemical signal that controls the anterior pituitary gland. So we would say hormonal control of this anterior pituitary gland. And then I think the second part of, I think that was the other question, which is there are 7 hormones that are produced here and released directly from here. But whether or not they are released depends on whether or not they're told to do so by the hypothalamus. Okay. So again, back to this picture. What I liked this picture because it shows you there are a mixture of different hormones that the hypothalamus can produce that, again, are going to cause growth hormone to be released, corticotropic hormone to be released, that's the adrenal cortex, gets stimulated or doesn't. Gonadotropic releasing hormone, this would be the stimulation of follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. Or you could have gonadotropin inhibiting hormone, right? And that would inhibit this anterior pituitary gland from releasing follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. In fact, one of the case studies that we will see on Tuesday is about this connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland, and then hormones coming from that anterior pituitary gland and where they go. What I kind of don't like about this picture, if I could critique it, it leaves out melanocyte stimulating hormone. It only shows 6 of those hormones coming from the anterior pituitary gland. So I had to throw one more thing in there, which I'll just do real quick, which was this slide. It seems like there's a whole lot going on with this slide, and there is, but what I like about it is if we just want to think about that anterior pituitary gland, you can see the 7 hormones that we need to remember that come out of that anterior pituitary gland. To be specific, they're produced there. They are released from there. It even kind of shows us where they go. We're about to get to that, but for now, let's not worry about that. Let's just remember the 7 hormones that come from the anterior pituitary gland. If you want to go ahead and remember which 4 are tropic and which 4 are non-tropic, that's fine. The other thing that I like about this picture is that it shows that that anterior pituitary gland doesn't have any direct neural connection to it, right? It shows that the hypothalamus is controlling this anterior pituitary gland, but it's controlling it kind of in an indirect way. It's using those hormones, those chemical signals to control the anterior pituitary gland. So indirectly controlled by hormones, those releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. And that was unique about the anterior pituitary gland because we can see right here the posterior pituitary gland has a direct neural connection to it. And there again are those two hormones that are released from that posterior pituitary gland. The other thing that I also like about this picture, this is what I would have put if I drew it on the board. There is, when we were looking at these pictures here, it didn't show all the collections of nuclei in the hypothalamus. So there is this picture that at least it doesn't name the nuclei, but it shows us that there's another nuclei that has a cell body and dendrites there in the hypothalamus, and it has a really long axon portion that leaves this hypothalamus and goes directly into that adrenal medulla. So it's another way that the hypothalamus can directly control an endocrine gland. And again, neural signals are very quick, so they can very quickly get this epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. So to summarize the hypothalamus, basically, it can directly control. It has these direct pawls in adrenal medulla and posterior pituitary gland. Then indirectly, it has to control that anterior pituitary gland by way of those chemical signals. Okay, I'm going to jump back to the slides that I just skipped over because it just kind of introduces us to those hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. So I don't want to skip over any of them. I think we see 6 or 7 different hormones here of the anterior pituitary gland. I mentioned growth hormone. This is something that's going to target things like bones and muscle and stimulate the growth of more bones and muscle. So it's often not considered a tropic hormone. I say often not considered a tropic hormone because if you get into some physiology textbooks, they will point out that sometimes this growth hormone can stimulate the liver to release hormones. And if it does that, then it's acting as a tropic hormone, right? But anyway, most of the time it doesn't, so most textbooks leave that off. Here is the thyroid gland. We can see coming from the anterior pituitary gland, there is a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. If it hits this thyroid gland, it's going to cause the thyroid gland to pump out T3 and T4, which I see we don't have on this picture yet. But we see another picture of the thyroid gland coming up. We're not there yet. We're still on the anterior pituitary gland. So the other hormones to mention from the anterior pituitary gland, we've got our adrenocorticotropic hormone. I'll abbreviate this one as ACTH. That is just going after the adrenal cortex. Right? And the hormones in that adrenal cortex are, I think of the hormones in the cortex of that adrenal gland as almost being the opposite of the hormones in the adrenal medulla. Right? The hormones in the adrenal medulla are all about epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's about burning through your glucose reserves. We've got to figure out how to eliminate this threat or get away from a threat very quickly. So you burn through all your reserves very quickly. That's epinephrine and norepinephrine in the middle. But here in the adrenal cortex, these are what are sometimes called glucocorticoids or mineral corticoids. I like to think of those as the conservation hormones. So glucocorticoids are going to conserve the amount of glucose that you have. Mineral corticoids are going to conserve minerals like sodium. Right? There was, what was it, that guy that went hiking and got his arm stuck and had to saw his arm off, right? Like that is a situation. Imagine we're rock climbing and all of a sudden we slip down and our arm is stuck, right? There's going to be probably a few minutes where we're freaking out and we're like, oh my God, can I rip my arm away from this? What are my options? Am I going to get out of this? And then, slowly after an hour goes by, your heart rate starts to slow down and you're like, okay, I'm stuck. I'm not getting out of this. So your brain stops burning through glucose and stops trying to figure out what are you going to do and switches into conservation mode. No telling how long we're going to be here. We better start to conserve the glucose and conserve the water. So again, adrenal cortex is conservation hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone, we're going to see in females this stimulates follicle development, but in males it stimulates sperm production. Oops. Luteinizing hormone, I mentioned, we'll talk more about this. Luteinizing hormone in females, it really just stimulates the rupture of a follicle that's mature and stimulates ovulation. Whereas luteinizing hormone in males is going to stimulate some of the cells in the testes to produce testosterone. So a good example of a tropic hormone because it targets another endocrine gland and causes that endocrine gland to release hormones. Last one to mention is prolactin. It goes after mammary glands and just gets them to produce milk. So a non-tropic hormone. I think we've seen the next slide, so we'll jump past that. And now we have actually gone past the pituitary gland and we're going to get into the thyroid and parathyroid gland. So probably halfway through information for tonight. Let's see how we're doing on time. I'm not doing great on time, but at least there's not a big lab that we have to worry about. So if I can just get a little bit further through that, I'll stop at some point. But again, we had to spend most of our time talking about anterior pituitary gland, so I feel like we're past that now. We should be able to make up some good time. Let's talk now about the thyroid gland. Here, the thyroid gland, we're going to find it on some of these respiratory models where it'll be just present on one side of it. Obviously, in real life, you've got the lobes of the thyroid gland on either side, but they always remove them from one half of the model. If we were to look closely at that glandular tissue, right, take a cross-section through it and look at it under the microscope, it would look something like this. And you can kind of tell that we're looking at thyroid tissue because there are these large follicles, these little pink patches. And notice how some of those pink patches, it looks like they've had a little bite taken out of them, right? This follicle is filled with a protein. It's called a colloid material. We don't really have to know that. But what it serves as, basically, these cells that line these follicles are the ones that have to build T3 and T4. This is the metabolism hormone that gets your cells active. And in order to build T3 and T4, they grab chunks of this colloid material. And you can see that they've been hard at work using that colloid material to manufacture this T3 and T4. We don't have to get into the details of all of this, but let me show a sketch of this that's a little bit clearer. This is just one of those follicles, and I like the sketch because it kind of shows a distinction between the cells that directly touch that colloid material. These are going to be what we call follicular cells. They touch that follicle. Follicular cells are the ones that produce T3 and T4. That's what I was just trying to say. T3 and T4, again, they grab that colloid material, and then out of the backside, they release T3 and T4 right into those blood vessels. Okay, that's one of the cells. The other cell that you can see here are these blue cells that are not directly touching the follicle, but they're close. So we don't call them follicular cells, we call them parafollicular cells, indicating they're close to that follicle. They don't produce T3 or T4. Instead, they are going to produce what we call calcitonin. I guess that was already there. I guess that had been there the whole time, and I just now noticed that. But in the previous slide, I guess is only when we were looking, that's where we labeled follicular cells making their T3 and their T4. Here we can better see those parafollicular cells that are making their calcitonin. Calcitonin is going to be something that is going to cause those osteoblasts to lay down new bone tissue. And to do that, they're going to grab calcium out of the bloodstream and build new bone. So calcitonin decreases blood calcium levels. Let's see what the next slide is. I'm actually just going to jump over to this one real quick, and then we're going to go back to those slides I just jumped over. We were looking at the thyroid gland, right? This patch of glandular tissue, and we saw that some of the cells in that thyroid gland are either producing T3 or T4, those are the follicular cells, and then parafollicular cells are producing that calcitonin. I jumped ahead to this slide so that we can see the parathyroid gland, even though we kind of introduced this earlier in the slides. We know parathyroid glands are going to be releasing parathyroid hormone, and parathyroid hormone is going to act to boost those blood calcium levels, so stimulates osteoclast, dissolves bone. Together we can see that antagonizing relationship between those two hormones. Now I'm gonna jump back to these real quick, just because it kind of sets up one of these things that we're likely to see on Tuesday with this case study. It involves the thyroid gland, it involves the hypothalamus, and it involves this anterior pituitary gland. The numbers here are just kind of showing you the sequence of events, right? It all starts here in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus decides to either send inhibiting hormone or releasing hormone. If it's sending thyroid releasing hormone, then once that travels through this hypothalamic portal vein, it's going to stimulate these cells here to pump out thyroid stimulating hormone. So anterior pituitary gland, if it's told to do so, releases this thyroid stimulating hormone, and it's this thyroid stimulating hormone that goes over to those follicular cells. Let me go back to this picture here. Follicular cells are going to produce T3 and T4 if they are told to by that thyroid stimulating hormone. That's how that typically works. This picture that we were seeing of these individuals are people that have enlarged thyroid glands, and this is referred to as a goiter. And it could be due to a couple of things. One could be there is signals coming from the hypothalamus, right? If we go back to this slide here, if these neurons are overactive and they're sending too much of this thyroid releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary gland, that's going to cause this thing to overproduce thyroid stimulating hormone. If there's an overproduction of thyroid stimulating hormone, it's going to cause those goiters to form. What's interesting is that we will also kind of talk about different autoimmune diseases as we go through, and we'll see that Graves' disease is one possible case study that we might run into. It's a case where your body mistakenly confuses certain cells, in this case the thyroid glands, as being foreign to the body, and they basically attack them. What it causes is it causes your body to produce this substance called TSI. It's thyroid stimulating immunoglobulins. So globulins, like we talked about proteins, there's all types of, albumin, globulins, and fibrinogen. Those were, well, we haven't talked about that yet. I'm thinking about our blood lecture next time. We will talk about proteins that float around in the blood. One of these are going to be these globulin proteins. Some of them trick the immune system. So this thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin is one of these substances that the body can produce that tricks things like the thyroid gland into thinking that there's too much thyroid stimulating hormone going around. This is one of the causes of Graves' disease. It's not that there's one more here. It's not that there's too much thyroid stimulating hormone. It's just that there's another substance in the body that's mimicking the effects of thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay. Anyway, past the thyroid gland and past the parathyroid gland. Well, I guess one more slide on the parathyroid gland. I said the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone. And if we were to look at those parathyroid glands under magnification, there's not a whole lot of detail. Here's a close-up view of that parathyroid gland. What you see is just a collection of these closely packed together, kind of round, plump cells. These are called chief cells. So maybe remember that chief cells are found in the parathyroid gland, and those are the cells that pump out parathyroid hormone. Trying to cruise quickly through the rest of these glands. One of the next ones on the list we said was the pineal gland. Remember, we had to find that on the half brain model. It sits towards the back side of the thalamus. It's on the opposite side of the thalamus. How can I say that again? Here's the hypothalamus, right? And if we go to the opposite side, if we cross that thalamus, then opposite of the hypothalamus, you have the pineal gland. What we need to know about that pineal gland is that it produces and releases melatonin. We may have mentioned that last semester, or I could be getting my semesters confused again. But melatonin is going to be one of these things that helps regulate your sleep and wake cycles. There are It turns out neurons in your eyeballs that don't have anything to do with forming an image, right? There are some of these neurons that send signals to endocrine glands like this pineal gland and tell something about how bright it is outside, whether it's light or whether it's dark. And this adjusts your circadian rhythm. Like, you know, if you forget to set your alarm clock one day, if you always set your alarm clock and you're used to waking up at a certain time, but then one day you forget to set your alarm clock, you will still wake up pretty close to that time that you're used to waking up. And that rhythm is set by this melatonin that comes from the pineal gland. Now we're back to talking about that adrenal gland, and it looks like this slide we are going to look first at that adrenal medulla. We know the hormones that come from that adrenal medulla are epinephrine and norepinephrine. There's a neural connection there and a neural stimulus, so they are very quickly released into the bloodstream. Here's a cross section through an endocrine gland, and over here, you know, there's a few different shades of a pinkish color. And as we go through this, maybe this is the most zoomed out picture. And you can see there's a little middle patch of this adrenal gland where the cells look like they're a little bit different shaped. In fact, here we've zoomed in on this picture. And the cells that are kind of a little bit larger shape, we see down here at the bottom of this slide. I wish this was a little bit more in focus. These cells are a little bit more plump compared to the rest of the ones out here in the cortex of the adrenal gland. So the M just stands for that adrenal medulla. These are all the cells that produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then there's the cortex of this adrenal gland, which we can see there's kind of a lighter area of pink and a darker area of pink. When we zoom in, you can again see this darker area of pink and a lighter area of pink that are found out there in the cortex. Let's put some names with those cells. So this is a sketch that is a little bit easier to recognize. You can see down here in the medulla, there's a better picture of the size of these cells are a little bit larger compared to the size of the cells out there in the cortex. These are much smaller cells. Okay, so adrenal medulla has the plump cells, and then the cortex has a collection of smaller cells. You can also see the name that we have associated with those cells. Well, at least here you can see the layers of those cells. Let me jump to this slide just to give you the names. The adrenal cortex, we're going to have to know, is split into 3 different zones. There is an outer layer, this zona glomerulosa. This is very thin. Then the zona fasciculata and zona reticularis. These are hard to distinguish between the two, but if we go back to this sketch somewhere, here is that zona glomerulosa. I said that's very thin, it's the outermost layer. But then here we have that zona fasciculata and zona reticularis. I don't know that this is going to be very important when we have our exam, but we do need to know the cortex and the medulla, that there's a difference between the two. You do need to know the different hormones that come from this cortex, that it's controlled by hormones, where this is neurally controlled, that medulla. So the hormones that come from there that we need to remember, well, this one was already up there, so I keep going back and forth between this slide. But the cortex is where we have those conservation hormones, the cortisol and androgens, sometimes referred to as glucocorticoids or mineral corticoids. There, in those medulla cells, we've got epinephrine and norepinephrine. Here, there are names of those cells that we need to know in that adrenal medulla, if I can ever get to it. Here we are. The adrenal medulla, like we said, those more plump cells are producing epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the names of those cells are called chromaffin cells. So we didn't have names of the ones in the cortex, we just had to know the names of the different layers of the cortex. I think there's some questions in the lecture handout about that. There may be some questions in the online quiz about that, but not very many. Okay, so that takes us through the adrenal gland, and we are quickly approaching the end here. In fact, I think we only have 3 more glands to go through. Here is the pancreas. We might have seen this picture earlier. There's kind of a indication of where the pancreas gland sits, just right there next to the rest of the digestive organs. And here, if we look at a patch of some of the cells of the pancreas, there are a bunch of these cells that produce digestive enzymes that we talked about, and we're not really concerned with those. We're concerned with this patch of cells that produces chemical signals. And somewhere in this patch of cells, there are going to be 2 types of cells. One is called alpha cells, the other ones are called beta cells. We need to remember that alpha cells are the ones that produce glucagon, that boost blood glucose level. Beta cells are going to be the ones that produce insulin. Insulin obviously reduces blood glucose levels. Here's the last big slide that we talk about. I like this slide because it gives us a good chance to review stimuli that cause certain cells to release hormones. And it also is a nice review of some of the things, if you remember 1406, talking about membrane transport, how things move in and out of the cell. Let's start. I'll just come over here and use this pointer. And we can start 2 ways. I feel like a lot of times, Troy, when we were asking questions last time, we started at the bottom, right? We started at the very last and we were like, okay, this cell, this is one of the beta cells. We know beta cells release insulin, and we can see that beta cell releasing insulin right there. But, you know, if we want to go back and see the whole story, like how did it start to release insulin? These cells and these cellular processes remind me of one of those, they're called Rube Goldberg machines. Does that ring bells to anybody? I might have shown you one of these things last time. It's like one of those weird long things where like somebody drops a ball and it spins around and causes some lever to move, and then a rope swings and drops something else, it turns a light switch on or something. There's like all these little steps and it just ends up turning some kind of light switch on. That's similar here. There are going to be all these steps that end up just causing the release of insulin. Insulin is only going to be released if there's too much glucose in the bloodstream, right? You wouldn't want to produce insulin if it wasn't necessary. So the trigger to release insulin, it's a fluid trigger, right? It's a humoral trigger, and the trigger is too much glucose in the bloodstream. So if there's too much glucose in the bloodstream, that's what's good about this 1406 review. Remember, glucose was one of these molecules that's too big and it's polar, it's charged. It can't just cross this plasma membrane anywhere. It needs some type of facilitator. It needs a door. And in this case, there's this GLUT2. There's like 20 different glucose transporting proteins. That's what GLUT stands for, glucose transporter. They are numbered basically after, in the order that they were discovered. We're going to probably encounter 4 or 5 of them. GLUT2s are found on beta cells, and what they do is if there's more glucose outside the cell than there is inside the cell, then glucose is going to move down its concentration gradient and into the cell. But if there's not a lot of glucose out here, then it's never going to move in, and this cell will never need to produce insulin. But here's a good example of this humoral control. If there is a bunch of glucose in the fluid, then glucose moves into the cell. That's step 1. The second step is, now that this cell has access to glucose, what it does is it uses that glucose as a fuel source. It breaks it down. It starts to rip it apart. And as it rips apart those chemical bonds, it produces energy in the form of ATP. Right? So this glucose has now been ripped apart and converted into fuel, converted into ATP. What that ATP is going to be used to do is ATP is going to attach to this protein channel up here that would normally be open. It would normally allow potassium to leave the cell. But ATP is going to close that gate and prevent potassium from leaving. Potassium has a positive charge to it, and now it can't leave the cell. It starts to accumulate in the cell. And as soon as the cell accumulates enough of those positive charges, it crosses that threshold from what we would consider depolarization. The charge becomes great enough that you get this electrical current that ripples down this membrane, and this story should sound familiar. This electrical current opens a voltage-gated calcium channel. Calcium moves into the cell, it surrounds these vessels, and when the vessels are surrounded by calcium, they're pulled to the edge of that membrane and they release their contents through exocytosis. Right? We said this a lot last time at that neuromuscular junction, or at the ends of neurons. In order for a neuron to release its neurotransmitters, voltage-gated calcium channels have to open up. Calcium has to come in for that neurotransmitter to be released. We can see that same situation set up here. But again, instead of an action potential coming from a neuron, that depolarization is coming from the buildup of potassium ions inside the cell. Again, the reason that potassium ions are building up is because the gate that they normally leave out of is closed. And the reason that's closed is because we have abundant ATP. The only reason we have ATP is because there's abundant glucose. Again, if there wasn't glucose coming in, we wouldn't have the ability to do any of those things. So it kind of shuts itself off. Good example of humoral control. Last two, there is the testes, which again we see more, I think even in the lab we have to know reproductive structures early on in the semester. But this slide shows us that inside the testes there are these coiled seminiferous tubules, or like a coiled garden hose. And if we take a cross section through one of those seminiferous tubules, you can see there are cells that line the inside lining of that seminiferous tubules. These are going to be the cells that are target cells of follicle stimulating hormone. It's going to stimulate these cells to divide and produce more sperm. But in addition to these spermatogenic cells that we see inside the seminiferous tubules, notice how there is a collection of these other cells. They're basically in between these little spaces, in between those seminiferous tubules. Since they're in this in-between space, they're called interstitial cells. And it's those little interstitial cells that absorb luteinizing hormone and in turn spit out testosterone. So again, testes, we consider them an endocrine gland because they produce testosterone, and they only do so when they are told to produce testosterone by that luteinizing hormone. Last one, I think that is the last one, and that is we're just looking at a cross-section of an ovary here. We did have an ovary model that was out somewhere. This is showing you an ovary that has a follicle at every stage of development. And this is not, you wouldn't have an ovary that has all of these things going on at once. Typically one or two or maybe a handful of these follicles will stimulate during any 28-day cycle. But we will see this ovarian cycle and how what happens in the ovary controls what happens in the uterus, because there are hormones that are produced here by the ovary. The ones that we need to know are estrogen and progesterone. We'll see estrogen coming from these follicular cells and then progesterone coming from these luteal cells. They each are going to move back through the bloodstream and go to other places in the body, where they have their own roles, among those roles controlling what happens in the uterus. So we'll see the ovarian and uterine cycle, and the ovary controls what's going on in the uterus, not vice versa. Okay, I got all the way through that endocrine slide, PowerPoint, but we still have more to go through because it's just a little bit. What I didn't get to do today is put a list of endocrine glands on the board and a list of the hormones that come out of them, and then maybe indicating where some of those hormones go. So I'd like to set that thing up as a review for next time. I'll leave that on the board whenever I do write that on the board next time, and we'll use that as a resource to get through this thyroid case study that I plan on bringing on Tuesday as well. I'm going to open it up, I guess, to any questions, because I've gotten all the way through the slides. We'll see if we can stir up any questions real quick, and then after that, if you want to take a break, you're welcome to do so. I will, on the other side of that break, point out a few more of those models from our organ system survey. I know I spent a lot of time in lecture already, so I may not have given myself enough time to get all the way through those, but we will definitely be able to get all the way through them on Tuesday. And that still leaves you at least a solid week to review those things before the practical, which I think is still at least 2 or 3 weeks away. Hopefully that wasn't too fast-paced. Did I stir up any questions at all? Everybody just soaking it in? Yeah.
So the posterior pituitary gland, he said it Does the two, oh, you know, I just answered that question. Does the two hormones and then, but it's mostly neural stimulated.
That's right. So you took good notes. You got it. That's right. And you know, I probably said that multiple different ways today, so it might have gotten kind of confusing. But you're right. That's why I kind of like this one slide that looked like it was busy.
Yeah.
But it's nice because it shows there's the direct neural connection to that posterior pituitary gland, direct neural connection to adrenal medulla, but there is no direct neural connection to anterior pituitary gland. We've got to use that portal vein and send those chemical signals through the bloodstream to control that indirectly by hormones. Good distinction, though. It's a lot just to get, you know, at one time in one layer, but we'll put a second layer down on top of that. And I recommend, you know, making things like note cards, like putting a list of endocrine gland names on one side of the note card, and then putting like the hormone on the back side of the note card, so you can kind of test yourself. You know, if you're just reading it over and over in the textbook, that never gets away from short-term memory, and it won't be there when you need it on the exam. But if you can just practice studying in one of those memory retrieval ways, you don't have to study as long, and it's more effective studying time. Again, I'll try and share tips like that as we get close to those exams. But if not, I will consider that done for our endocrine lecture, at least the first part of it. If you want to stretch your legs or do anything like that, feel free to do so. I've got a couple of extra copies of the lab list if you wanted an extra one or if you didn't get one last time. I'm going to sip on my coffee for a little bit, and then I'll gather these models and we'll see how far I can get through the organ system survey.